18. Now, I'm only going to talk about the questions that some of you got wrong. And this first one that some people missed is a rather important one for your understanding of the language. So, which of the following is an example in English of a stem change from past to present, or maybe present to past, be a better way to say it. And you can select more than one, and you have to. Actually, only one of these here is not an example of a stem change from present to past. Now, what do I mean by a stem change? Well, first of all, let's think about how we would communicate a change in tense from present to past in English. And the way we do that is by adding an ed, right? So this first one is made exactly like that. We have jump. And then in order to make it jumped, we have the stem jump, but we have the ed ending, and that ed ending indicates that it's past. So this first one is not an example of a stem change from present to past, because jump remains the same. We simply add the ed. But now if you notice the rest of these, you do have a change in the spelling of the word. There's no ed ending. The closest we get is the de ending, but it's a different word. Ride and rode, right? I ride the car, but then after you get to where you're going, somebody might say, how did you get there? And you say, well, I rode a car or a minibus or something like that, right? So, but you don't say I rided the car. You say I rode the car. You have a different word. The stem changes. There's a spelling change in the stem. Eat and ate, right? You're eating your meal. Someone comes up to you in the midst of having lunch at the school, and they say, what are you doing? And you say, well, I'm eating. I eat this food. But then afterwards, you walk to class, and someone says, what did you just do? And you say, well, I ate a meal, right? Eat changes to ate. You don't say I eated the meal. You say I ate the meal. And we have a stem change. The same thing with go and went, a pretty drastic stem change. None of the letters in go are still there in went. It completely changes. And so the purpose of this question here, and your book makes the similar point as well, is to let you know that with the second aorist, when we talk about a stem change in the word to indicate it being an aorist tense, Greek's not doing something that English doesn't do. You might say to yourself, why in the world does the Greek language do this? No other language in its right mind would ever change the spelling of the verb when you change tenses. Well, English does that. In fact, English does it a whole lot more than Greek. So we've got to recognize that. Okay, now how is a second aorist formed? Well, as I said before, we have a spelling change, and your book explains it. I'm not going to go through and reteach this. I'm going to assume that you've actually read it in your book, because it's going to give you a thorough explanation. But and I'm actually a little disappointed that so many of you missed this question here. We have the stem change. In order to form the second aorist, we have the stem change in the lexical form. So, for instance, lambano becomes elabon. We notice the mu drops out when it goes from the original form to the second aorist form. And the question here is, what kind of endings get added to the word? Well, it's not the aorist endings, right? That's the whole point of it being a second aorist. It's not formed in the same way that a normal aorist is formed, right? The normal aorist has the sa endings, the sigma alpha endings. And you notice the second aorist doesn't have that. What kind of endings does the second aorist have? Well, it has the same endings as the imperfect, right? So notice, compare the second aorist forms with the imperfect, this is too small, active indicative, right, of the same word. So lambano, if it's imperfect, and we already learned the imperfect endings, right? You have these type of endings that you see here with the epsilon augment at the very beginning. And that is how you form the imperfect, right? You know that, you learned that. Well, the second aorist looks a lot like the imperfect active indicative here, except instead of the full stem, we have a change in the stem. And that's what we have right here. The mu drops out and we have a different stem. And when you see the change in the stem along with the imperfect endings and the epsilon augment, that lets you know what we're dealing with here is not the imperfect that you might think upon first glance because you have these endings. It's not the imperfect, but it is the aorist, the second aorist. And of course, the second aorist gets translated in exactly the same way as the first aorist does. It's only a difference in the way in which that aorist is formed. First aorist, no change of spelling in the stem, and you have the epsilon augment, and then you have the first aorist endings, the sa endings. Second aorist, we have a change in the stem, and the imperfect endings are added. Okay, so please review that so that you understand it. There are a lot of second aorist verbs in the New Testament. Actually, to be technical, there aren't that many of them. They just are the ones that occur most frequently. The most frequent aorists, the verbs that are translated aorist most frequently, or are in aorist form most frequently in the New Testament are second aorist verbs. So you need to know this. Okay, and let's practice some second aorist translations. Okay, so the first is Galatians 3:2. And I gave you the reference here because I thought it would be helpful for you to look it up. It says, Talta manon thelo mathane of humon ex ergon namu ta penuma elabete ex akaes pisteos. Okay, so how do we translate that? Well, this only, Paul is speaking here, first person, I want to learn from you. And off is just the preposition apa, but it's abbreviated there because we have a vowel that follows it. This only I want to learn from you. And let me just do a quick parsing of this word here, mathane. Now, you might look at it and think, oh, well, this is clearly the present infinitive ending. And it is the present infinitive ending. But notice here, when I look it up in my online lexicon, it says that, this is the same word here, but it says it's aorist active infinitive. What's going on? Why is it that ending in aorist? Well, it's a second aorist. I wish it would actually say the second aorist there. Make it proper too. I wish it would say a second aorist there because that's what it is. Notice here's the root, monthano, that's the root, and we have a spelling change. Monthano becomes mathane. Notice the nu drops out. It goes from matha to matha. And that's just another example of the second aorist showing up. It's not an imperfect ending because there are no imperfect infinitives. It's the present. But with the present infinitive ending and the stem change, it lets us know that it is aorist. Now, you haven't learned that yet. It's not till chapter 22, so you'll learn that in the fall, Lord willing. But I thought it was still worth pointing that out. Of course, at the end of the day, we translate at least at this stage of our learning, we translate the present infinitives the same way we translate the aorist infinitives. So it doesn't much matter in terms of translation, but thought that was worth pointing out. Okay, so this only I want to learn from you. And notice here we're dealing with a question. Did you receive the Spirit from the works of the law or from hearing of faith? Or the works of law or hearing of faith? Did you receive the Spirit from works of law or from hearing of faith? And basically, you guys had that a healing there instead of a hearing, but that was probably a typo. Yeah, you're basically getting that thing. Now, the one thing to recognize for this lesson 18 is that elabeta here, notice it looks like it's not an aorist ending, right? It has that eta, no seta ending or anything like that. And it has the augment in the front, so it looks imperfect. But if you look this up in the lexicon, labe, if you start looking that up, labeo or something like that, you're not going to find it. It's from lambano, but there's a spelling change in the verb which lets us know that what we're dealing with here is a second aorist, and we want to translate it as you would an aorist, not an imperfect. Right, so we don't say did you or are you receiving or do you receive the Spirit, more like a present. We say did you receive the Spirit, which is going to be the aorist. Now I just want to point out something else in this verse. This is a verse that I think is very important in our understanding of theology, and I want to read a section by a guy named Grant McCaskill in his book Living in Union with Christ, Paul's Gospel and Christian Moral Identity. He makes a big deal about this verse and the Greek of this verse. So I just want to point this out to you as an incentive for you to keep studying Greek so that you can see these same things, or at least be able to read material like this and go back to the Greek and see if it's right or not. So listen to this. Here's what he says. I'm not going to test you on this or anything, but this is just to encourage you to keep going in Greek because it really does help you in your understanding of theology. This alone I wish to ask you. Did you receive the Spirit from the works of the law or from the hearing of faith? And notice that this is his own translation. This is a dense and important verse. Paul focuses on the reality of the Spirit. And again, note that he is speaking to people who have received the Spirit, not to those outside the community of salvation. And asks whether the Spirit has come from the, quote, works of the law or from the hearing of faith. I translate that last expression clumsily, but literally, because I want to bring out its force. It is sometimes translated as believing what you heard or as hearing with faith, but I think these renderings mask the nature of the contrast. The word that I have translated as hearing is koe. We get our word acoustics from this root. It is a noun designating something that has been heard. We would normally use it not for a message that has been written and read, but for one that we have listened to. We might even translate it, quote, the acoustics of faith, since it is linked to the genitive of the noun pistis. The crucial element is that there exist two different ways of relating to the thing mentioned in the two contrastive parts of this question. Right? Two different ways of getting the Spirit, or of trying to get the Spirit. Did you get the Spirit as a performer of the works of the law or as a listener to the acoustics of faith? And he's making a contrast here between the whole idea of performing or listening. And he's saying that the translation acoustics of faith, or the recognition that it's the hearing that puts you in a passive state when you receive that action. Is it through that active performing or through that passive listening? He's getting at that contrast. And here he'll explain it better than I just did. Here is the subtle point. The first makes you the principal agent, the performer of the works of the law, and the other makes you into someone who appropriates the performance of someone else, the one who listens to the acoustics of faith. One makes you the owner of what is achieved, the proprietor of righteous acts. The other makes you a beneficiary of the virtuosity of another person. So I won't belabor this anymore. This isn't the Acts and Paul class, although most of you are in the Acts of Paul class and you've heard me reference Grant McCaskill again and again. I really like his work, or most all of his work, and he is very sensitive to the Greek text. And so I just read this to you as an encouragement to keep studying the Greek, and you'll be able to notice these things as well. Hopefully, from what you know already, you can go back and look at that translation and see, kind of see what he's actually getting at here. Okay, next passage, Revelation 10. Kai elaban ta bibla ridian ek tes kairos tu ageliu kai kataphagon alta. Okay, and what do we have here? The translation. And I received the scroll out of the hand of the angel, and I ate it. And there's a debate whether the kata on the front of estheo or fugon in the second aorist form, there's a debate whether the kata is intensifying this. Should it be, and I devoured it? Or is it really just a synonym for astheo rather? And astheo comes later on in the translation, in the verse as well, the next verse, I think. So anyway, we won't get into that now. We just want to recognize the second aorist here and think a little bit about the translation. So notice this, Elaban. Looks like not an aorist ending there, right? It looks like a imperfect ending. You see the on there would be an imperfect ending, and it has the epsilon augment at the beginning. So hey, looks like the imperfect. Well, except we don't have the stem that we would need to for it to be the imperfect. We have a stem change. Lambano is changed to elaban, and it's that stem change that gives this word away as a second aorist, and we translate it as a second aorist. Not I take the scroll, but I took the scroll, and that's how all of you did, except for somebody holding the scroll. I think that's a way of translating lambano, but this case, took would be better. And let's see if there's anything else we want. We could also point out that kata f. Here's another second aorist, right? So if you look at this word kata phagon, the root is estheo. Now estheo changes to now. Let's see. We'll talk about the prepositional prefix in a minute. But notice here, this stem changes. Let me use a different color. This changes to this when it turns into the second aorist form. If you listened to, and I hope you did, the Robert Plummer giving his sort of memory devices for the second aorist, you would remember this word. And I think he says that one student tried to remember that estheo changes to a fugon because eat. This is to eat, but then in the aorist tense it would be ate, and a little child might say, "Oh, foo gone," is in the food's gone. Anyway, that might help you remember it or not. The point is the stem radically changes when we get over into the second aorist. But you might think, wait a minute, where is the prefix? Why don't we see an epsilon at the beginning? Well, there's a prefix at the beginning, and the prefix kata, notice that it changes to kate, the alpha changes to an epsilon. And that right there, the change from the alpha to the epsilon, is the augment. When you have a prefix in front of a word, the augment doesn't occur at the very beginning of the prefix. It occurs after the prefix, before the actual stem of the word. And when you have a prefix that ends with a vowel, what you have is not the kata and then an epsilon, but the kata, the alpha and the epsilon right next to each other turns just into an epsilon. So that's how we get the spelling of that word. Okay, John 17:25. This one was a lot of fun with gnosko. So this is, we see gnosko all over the place here. And I just took out, this is not quite the full John 17:25 because there was a vocative word in there that I just took out that wasn't really necessary. How's it say? How's it read? Patre, or pater, kai, ha, cosmos, se, uk, egon, ego, de, se, egnon, kai, utoi, egnoson, hati su me apestelas. And how do we translate that? Father, also or even, the world does not know you, but I know you. And those, or they, know that you sent me. And we see a number of different forms of the second aorist of gnosko. The first one is right here. The world, and that's a singular, third person singular, does not know you. And that's right here for, let's try to do these with different colors here. Third person singular. The world does not know you. Egno. But I know you. I know you. And we're dealing with first person there. And we see the first person right here. Egnon. And then he talks about the believers. They know that you sent me. And when we're talking about the believers, we're dealing with the third person plural. And so we see the various forms of gnoska. Now, they're all aorist, but notice that none of them have the normal aorist endings. That's because gnosko, which is a very, very common word in the Greek New Testament, has a second aorist form. And this is a little bit different of a second aorist form than some of the other ones. It parses differently, so it's a good idea just to sort of commit these to memory, or at least study this chart so that you will be able to recognize it when you see it, because you will see it very often. Okay, Mark chapter 1, verse 11. Kai, phone, egnetea, ek, ton, uranon, su e ha huios, mu, ha agapetas, en soy udakesa. So how do we translate that? And a voice came out of the heavens, or out of heaven. You are my son, the beloved. Or you could also translate that you are my beloved son. In you I am well pleased. Now, we have the second aorist of ginomai, right here, egeneta. Now, we wouldn't think of this as an aorist form, and it's the aorist ending in and of itself. But with the stem change, we recognize that what's going on here is a second aorist. And notice that it is third person singular. a voice came, or there's ginomai is translated in a lot of different ways. A voice happened. You could even say a voice came out of heaven. You are my son. This could be either right here. It could be either a attributive adjective, beloved could be attributed adjective, you are my beloved son, or it could be you are my son, and then it just restates that, namely the beloved one. In you I am well pleased. Now, let me say something about this. This does look like an aorist form, and it is an aorist form, but the potential problem is this is the augment. It might appear at first that there's no augment, right? We have udoka, and the lexical form is exactly the same. Well, the reason for getting that is that when you have a word that begins with u, there's usually no lengthening of the vowel. So it usually stays u whether you have the augment on it or not. Now, this is one of the few cases where when you add an augment, you actually don't get any change to the beginning of the word at all. You can't add an augment to this. It stays exactly the same. Or maybe you could think of the fact that you add an augment and the epsilon drops off and the augment replaces the epsilon, and you still end up exactly in the same place you were before. Now, you might think, wait a minute, none of you translated this as a past tense. In you, I am well pleased, right? In aorist, often we translate that as a simple past, but none of you translated this. A voice came out of heavens and said, you are my beloved son, in whom I was well pleased, right? That would be a little bit odd. What's the Father think of the Son now? But we translated, I am well pleased. And the reason is you've got to remember that aorist has this perfective aspect. The author, therefore, is not thinking of the Father's pleasure in the Son as being a process, but a perfective reality. I am well pleased in terms of this timeless being well pleased. He is well pleased in the Son, not in terms of a process that the Father has arrived at, but as a stated reality. And that is the end. So I hope this has been helpful. Remember to go back and look at the second aorist rules, the forms, and please also review that the video, if you have enough internet, of Robert Plummer, who is going through and explaining the memory devices for the common second aorist in the New Testament. That will help you out a lot.